In September 1940, Italy formally declared war on Britain by launching an attack on British Egypt from Italian Libya. By December of that year, Churchill and his administration were able to respond by conducting Operation Compass, a 5-day military campaign that was considered a massive success to the British, given that they were able to capture 138,000 Italian prisoners of war and were able to push the Italians out of Egypt and force the retreat back to Tripoli. The successful British operation was only halted due to Churchill deciding to redirect troops to the Balkans, which was also under a joint Italian-German invasion. The reprieve in North Africa allowed Mussolini to request assistance from Germany, who obliged by sending the German Africa Corps, led by General Erwin Rommel, whose tactically superior forces were able to halt any further British advancements for the time being. At this point, the British still felt outmatched by the Axis powers, and recognizing something must be done to even the playing field, Churchill ordered the creation of the Special Operations Executive, which would serve as Britain's wartime intelligence agency, gathering Nazi intelligence behind enemy lines. Adjacently, he also ordered the creation of the Commandos, an elite special forces group which would pull from the best recruits the British military had to offer. The Commandos only numbered around 25,000 during the war, but their outside success proved the importance of special forces as a tool for reducing the total number of engagements, and they would go on to serve as a blueprint for future special forces such as the Army Rangers and Marines in the U.S. To oversee the new organizations, Churchill created a new wartime cabinet position called the Ministry of Economic Warfare. The autumn of 1940 also saw Germany try to destroy Britain's war production capabilities by starting the Battle of Britain, which saw massive fleets of Luftwaffe bombers bomb key cities across Britain for months in an event known as the Blitz. In the middle of December, a firebomb was dropped on the famed St. Paul's Cathedral. While Churchill had preemptively ordered professional firefighters and volunteers to guard the church, which would end up saving the structure, the fire spread across the capital, killing 160 people in what became known as the Second Great Fire of London. All in all, the German campaign destroyed 2 million homes and killed 42,000 civilians, but failed to significantly disrupt British war production due to poor intelligence and the fact that Britain had strategically spread out war production facilities across the country. While being able to stave off a German invasion of Britain served as a major morale booster, Churchill knew he would be unable to defeat Germany without the introduction of American support. This was first provided in the second half of 1940 with the Destroyers for Bases deal, which saw FDR transfer 50 destroyer ships to Britain in exchange for the right for the U.S. Navy to dock in British Bermuda and Newfoundland. The success of the deal convinced FDR to then sign the Lend-Lease Act in March 1941, which ended American neutrality in the war by shipping supplies to the Allied powers in exchange for long-term debt promises. Adjusted for inflation, the U.S. ended up providing $690 billion to the Allies through the Lend-Lease program, with the Soviets finally paying off their loans in 1971 and Britain theirs in 2006. By June, Hitler had betrayed Stalin by invading the Soviet Union under Operation Barbarossa, which pushed the Soviets firmly into the Allied camp. Churchill had tried to warn Stalin since Britain had prior knowledge of the invasion, but Stalin ignored his warnings since he didn't trust him. The British government had uncovered the plans by decoding secret messages sent using the Enigma machine, an advanced cipher that was used by the Germans for the most closely guarded correspondence. MI6 had purchased a large country mansion near the town of Milton Keynes, known as Bletchley Park, which would serve as the headquarters for the government code and cipher school during the war. The school was 75% female and headed by the renowned British inventor Alan Turing. The cryptanalysis conducted at Bletchley Park to decode the Enigma led to the invention of the first programmable electronic computer, the Colossus, which Turing is credited with spearheading. In August, Churchill made the journey across the Atlantic to meet with FDR prior to America's entrance into the war to lay out the Allied goals for the post-war world order. The leaders agreed and stipulated in a document called the Atlantic Charter that the new order should respect the self-determination of people and nations of all sizes and disavowed the seizure of land as a form of territorial expansion. American entry into the war would occur shortly after on December 7th with the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. Britain declared war on Japan the following day after Japanese forces invaded British Malay. The British had maintained the colony of Malaya in Singapore since 1824, when the demarcation of possessions in Indonesia between the UK and Netherlands were spelled out in a treaty. The British defense of Malay was a disaster. The colony fell to the Japanese in 2.5 months, with the British losing 130,000 soldiers compared to Japanese losses of just 15,000. This defeat precipitated a follow-up conference between Churchill and FDR at the end of December in Washington, known as the Arcadia Conference, where the nations agreed that the principal threat was Nazi Germany, which should be defeated first before turning focus to the Japanese. The conference also produced a document known as the Declaration by the United Nations, which publicly outlined the views discussed in the Atlantic Charter and would serve as the basis for the United Nations following the war. The newfound focus on the European and African theater was first seen in Operation Torch, a joint operation between the US and UK, which would see the Americans land an invasion force in Morocco and Algeria and attack from the west, while the British would attack from the east from Egypt, with the two forces meeting in the middle to capture the city of Tunis. Algeria and Morocco, which had been administered by Vichy France, fell to the Allies in a single week, marking a big success. To celebrate the operation, Churchill traveled to the US to deliver an address to Congress. Following the address, Churchill suffered a heart attack and was ordered to rest by his doctor, a suggestion he stubbornly ignored, and he instead traveled to Canada to deliver another raucous speech to their parliament. At the end of 1941, the British resumed their campaign in North Africa with Operation Crusader, which would see the British forces rapidly advance on Rommels, forcing the Germans out of eastern Libya. Since the early days of the conflict, when Britain began its attempts to blockade Germany, they had largely commanded the ocean in the Battle of the Atlantic. Their dominance began to be tested when the Germans came up with a tougher Enigma code to crack, allowing the U-boats to operate undetected. It would take Bletchley Park a full year before they were able to crack the new code and regain decisive control in the Atlantic. This loss in naval intelligence is best illustrated by an event known as the Channel Dash, where a fleet of German battleships that were otherwise trapped off the French coast were able to sneak by Britain through the English Channel without being detected. Churchill was met with more bad news when he was notified that Singapore had quickly fallen to invading Japanese forces, with 80,000 British troops being captured, the largest capitulation in the country's history. 3 months later, in May of 1942, the Japanese would go on to capture the British colony Burma. The Burmese people and their army, the Burma Independence Army, initially supported the Japanese as they saw them as liberators from British rule, evidenced by the fact that they referred to the Burmese theater of World War II as the Fourth Anglo-Burmese War. Their favorable views of the Japanese would quickly sour once an authoritarian Japanese puppet state was installed, leading to continual clashes between the Allies and Axis for influence in the region. The British first entered Burma in 1824 with the First Anglo-Burmese War, where the key territories were seized and brought into the fold of the Raj. More territory was seized in the Second Anglo-Burmese War of 1852, and by the Third Anglo-Burmese War of 1885, the entirety of Burma was under British control. Burma would end up becoming an independent colony from India in 1937. That same month, more bad news came when Rommel launched a counterattack called the Gazala Offensive, where the Germans pushed the British back out of eastern Libya, culminating in the fall of Tobruk, where they lost an additional 35,000 troops to surrender. The British were able to eventually stop the Germans at the First Battle of El Alamein, which was dangerously close to the port of Alexandria and the Suez Canal. In India, Churchill attempted to garner support for the war effort by sending coalition members Stafford Cripps as part of the so-called Cripps mission to finally offer India Dominion status if they unconditionally offered Indian manpower for the army. The mission was a failure and had the opposite effect, with Mahatma Gandhi organizing the Quit India movement, which were massive nationwide protests by mostly Hindus against any form of continued British rule. While the British crushed the revolt by arresting 100,000 people and killing 1,000, it was beginning to become clear that any continued occupation would prove untenable and that a graceful exit would need to be achieved in the near future. The following year, the monsoon season significantly hindered British counteroffensives and supply shipments to the subcontinent, leading to the Bengal famine of 1943, where 2.3 million people starved to death. Churchill's government was reluctant to redirect badly needed supplies, especially with the assumption that India would be leaving the empire, which was later attributed as a major contributor to the extent of the famine. Back in June of 1942, Churchill returned to Washington to get an update on FDR's progress in readying U.S. troops to deploy to Europe. FDR stated that the Americans would still need more time to be ready for the now codenamed Operation Overlord, but he did give his 300 Sherman tanks and 100 howitzers to the North African campaign. Churchill would then travel on to Moscow with U.S. envoy to the Soviet Union, Avril Harriman, to meet with Stalin to discuss the priority of getting the U.S. to commit a faster timetable for the Western campaign. As 1942 came to a close, the tides turned decisively in Britain's favor in North Africa, where they badly defeated Rommel at the Second Battle of El Alamein and pushed the Germans completely out of Libya. The Allies felt so comfortable in their control of North Africa and the success of Operation Torch that they met in Morocco in January 1943 for the Casablanca Conference, along with Charles de Gaulle representing Free France. They agreed the best way to begin the invasion of Europe would be to concentrate on Sicily and move north up the Italian peninsula to first force Mussolini's surrender. While the invasion of Sicily would soon begin and go smoothly for the Allies, Churchill traveled to Washington in May to lobby FDR to focus on continuing the Italian theater until unconditional surrender. Churchill and FDR would again meet in August, this time in Quebec, to plan the details of Operation Overlord. During the conference, news broke that Sicily had fallen, and shortly after, the Italian army signed the Armistice of Cassabile, with the Allies ending hostilities. The King of Italy, in conjunction with the military, had arrested Benito Mussolini, ending his regime. The Germans responded by instantly attacking Italian forces across the front lines, seizing northern Italy and freeing Mussolini and installing him as leader of the puppet state, the Italian Social Republic. Churchill and FDR would next meet in Cairo in November, along with Chiang Kai-shek, where the nations agreed to demand Japan's unconditional surrender in the Pacific, return all occupied lands to China, drive the Japanese out of Burma, and establish China as the preeminent global power in the region. These frequent meetings between the leaders of the Allied powers would prove instrumental in the creation of the post-war world order, with the most monumental of these meetings being known colloquially as the Big Three, the first of which was the Tehran Conference in November 1943. The Qajar dynasty, which had long ruled Iran, had largely become a puppet state with influence over the country and its resources being divided between Russia and Britain during the Great Game. The Qajars were overthrown in 1925 in a military coup and replaced with the Pahlavi dynasty, who were much more nationalist and determined to regain Iran's sovereignty by staying neutral in World War II. Stalin and Churchill executed the joint Anglo-Soviet invasion of Iran to overthrow leader Reza Shah and install a pro-Ally puppet state ran by his son, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. The capture of Iran would guarantee Allied access to its vast quantities of oil and maintain access to the Soviet Union via the Indian Ocean. Thus, Tehran was a neutral place for Churchill, Stalin, and FDR to meet, with the conference yielding Britain and America's commitment to open the Western Front to provide relief to the Soviets against Germany, as well as his future promise for Iranian independence following the end of the war. Following the conclusion of the Tehran conference, Churchill and FDR returned to Cairo to meet with Turkish leader İsmet İnönü, but they were unable to get a commitment from him for Turkey to join the Allies. While since the capture of Sicily, the Allies had managed to take key territory in southern Italy, they faced the German-constructed Winter Line, a string of highly guarded defenses protecting Rome and northern Italy from an Allied assault, which would begin in January 1944 with the Battle of Anzio, it's an amphibious landing near metropolitan Rome. While the landing was treacherous, the most difficult part of the assault would be the Battle of Monte Cassino, where the Nazis used an existing large Catholic abbey situated on top of a hill as part of their defenses. The battle ended up lasting 4 months and saw the Allies capture Rome, but only after losing 55,000 soldiers versus German losses of 20,000. The slog that was the capture of the Italian capital convinced Churchill to go all in on D-Day, since he came to believe his previous strategy of an indirect invasion of continental Europe would not result in preserving Allied lives. His newfound enthusiasm was on display with his fascination with the so-called Mulberry Harbors, which were floating harbors developed by the Admiralty to be used in the invasion. Meanwhile, as the war was progressing, Parliament was able to capture the British public's attention with the publishing of the Beveridge Report drafted by William Beveridge, who was a member of the Liberal Party. Although the party was basically obsolete at the legislative level, his progressive ideas of reform were popular with the public, and this put pressure on Churchill to embrace enhancements to welfare ahead of the next election. The D-Day invasion at Normandy would officially begin in June 1944. Churchill was determined to travel with the troops on the first or second day of the invasion, but he was blocked directly by the king. Immediately after the invasion, Germany reacted by launching its V-1 cruise missiles at London in a terror bombing campaign meant to destroy resolve. In September 1944, Churchill returned to Canada for the Second Quebec Conference with FDR, where they discussed and agreed to the Morgenthau Plan, named for U.S. Secretary of Treasury Henry Morgenthau Jr., which aimed to divide Germany into separate demilitarized states with a neutral international zone, making up the Rhineland and Ruhr Valley, and the awardment of territory to its neighbors. Although later both governments would retract their support for the plan and label it as infeasible. In October, Churchill traveled back to Russia for the Fourth Moscow Conference, where he met with Stalin, where they agreed to divide post-war influence in the Balkan region between the Soviets and British in the notorious Percentages Agreement, which was a list of countries tacitly drawn on a note that stipulated the Soviets would have 90% control over Romania, 75% control over Bulgaria, with Yugoslavia and Hungary being split 50-50, and the British controlling the remaining interest. Inversely, Britain would have 90% control over Greece. Later, after Stalin's death, the Soviets would try and claim he never agreed to such an imperialist proposal. By January 1945, Churchill and FDR met in Malta to plan a united front against continued Soviet advancement into Central Europe during the second of the Big Three conferences with Stalin at Yalta in Crimea. At the conference, it was agreed that Germany would go through a process of denazification following the end of the war, with its territory being split up and occupied amongst the Allies. Additionally, they agreed to give Poland a territorial concession from Germany, and the Soviets would enter the war against Japan once hostilities in Europe had ceased. They also agreed to Operation Keelhaul, which would see the forced extradition of all Soviet citizens back to the Soviet Union, regardless of their refugee status, many of whom were wanted as anti-communists. In February, Churchill authorized the controversial firebombing of the German city of Dresden, resulting in the deaths of 25,000 civilians in an effort to capitulate a surrender. That surrender finally came in May, which marked the Allied victory in Europe and defeat of the Nazis, which came to be known as VE Day.